Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to this edition of Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Lynda Waddington. I'm a columnist here at the Gazette, and I'm also going to serve as your moderator this morning. Today we're going to talk about something that many of you probably know at least something about. We're going to talk about the reality TV and how it's dominating network and regular news stations here. So I have three people with me today to join in the topic. I have Mike Wyrick, who's the owner of Compass Advertising, Theresa Donofrio, who's the Esther and Robert Armstrong Assistant Professor of Rhetoric at Cole College. And I also have Frank Durham, who's an Associate Professor of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Iowa.
Hi.
Thank you all for being here this morning.
Thanks for having us.
So when we talk about reality TV, I think a lot of people believe that reality TV is something new. Actually, reality TV has been around at least since the 1970s, and it started in the UK. But originally, it wasn't nearly as salacious as some of the shows that are on television now. So what we want to talk about is, basically, is reality TV good for us? Does it make us better? Does it serve a purpose? And does it make a difference that there are different types of reality TV shows out there? So let me start first by airing my dirty laundry. I have seen quite a few reality TV shows on and off on different stations. There are only a handful that I actually watch regularly. Storage Wars, Ghost Adventures, Dancing with the Stars, and I'm going to blame that last one on Sean Johnson for getting me addicted. But I was wondering, panelists, what do you watch?
Well, I'd say my guilty pleasure is Survivor.
Okay.
And we've watched every season of that except for the very first one, and we really enjoy that. I like to think of it as a social experiment, and it's more than a game show for me, and that's really what I like about it, is watching how the people interact. So, and then I've seen a lot of shows. I'd had a 25-year-old son bounce boomerang back home for a couple of years until about a year ago. And so through their TV viewing habits, I've seen pretty much everything from Real Housewives to Kardashians to anything you can imagine. So I've got a little bit of experience with a lot, and a lot with only one.
Okay.
So.
How about you, Theresa?
I'm happy to talk about. I've certainly seen my fair share of reality television programs. I'd say the ones I follow most closely are the competitive cooking shows. That's probably we could talk about the genre of reality TV shows, and if we think competitive cooking shows kind of fall under the auspices of reality TV. But I'd also really love to come back to the point of framing as dirty laundry, because one of the things I'd like to talk about is reality TV something that we have to kind of pretend that we don't watch, as if it has a status that isn't as respectable as perhaps some other TV content. So if we're going to come back to that at some point, I would love to talk about is reality TV our dirty laundry?
Frank, how about you?
Well, I think the show Iron Chef was one of my favorites for a long time, as far as competitive cooking shows, when it was funny and it was engaging, and I liked it a lot. I do think that people watch reality television for the same reason they watch the Indy 500. There's always a chance of a spectacular crash, and there's a certain prurience involved in the Housewives show, for example, and getting particular insight into the arguments that people can have, or even on Dancing with the Stars, somebody may have a bad time, and so there's a kind of voyeurism involved in these shows, which might make them a bit of dirty laundry.
I kind of call it virtual rubbernecking. Like you might see an accident, you don't want to look, but you're going to look anyway. And I think especially different types of shows, I think, are more prone to be kind of kept hidden. Maybe the Housewives of Atlanta, you don't really want to admit that in certain social groups, but you might be more apt to admit Dancing with the Stars or Iron Chef, or some of the talent search shows. Yeah.
Interesting. I wanted to bring that up because I was thinking about what we're talking about in terms of reality TV as dirty laundry. Certainly part of a historical trajectory of looking at television in general as pretty lowly, right? That like we can trace it all the way back to like the 1960s with Newton Minow calling television a vast wasteland, or thinking about in the 80s as seeing television as a form of, as Neil Postman would talk about it, amusing ourselves to death. And I think on the whole, it's really easy then to put reality TV kind of into a general historical pattern of disparaging the contents of television. And I may end up coming to be the redeemer of what we're watching on reality television shows, but I think that to me, I tend to take a really optimistic perspective on media studies, and so I try to start with everything that, all the critiques of TV as corrosive or as insignificant, and work our way up to what the merit might be out of these television shows.
You know, people who are proponents of the shows say that by watching other people go through these extreme situations that we're actually learning more about ourselves. Anyone agree?
That may be Bruce Jenner's claim, but the Kardashians offer a kind of aspirational consumerism, and there's a myth offered by many of the shows that if only you were lucky enough, you too could have a cigarette racing boat, or you could be dressed as well as the women on Housewives or something like that. So I think there's a kind of moral component that's missing to many of these shows because they're misleading. They have more to do with winning the lottery than they do with what we would call reality.
So why do we think it is that originally they were documentaries? You know, it was a life maybe that we didn't understand, something to show us, to inform us, and now they've become more of a spectator sport. You know, why has that shift occurred?
Well, I would challenge the notion of a documentary because that's a kind of journalistic term, and I think that when documentaries are produced, they're studying somebody who lives in an actual context. And historically, I think reality television dates back to writer strikes in 1988, and more recently, television writer strike in 2006 and 2007. And so the ability to go with an unscripted kind of format was a labor issue. It was a union-busting effort by the networks. And so there's a capital history here, which may account for why we get a lot of sort of, for lack of a better term, fly-on-the-wall kinds of views of people and their behaviors.
I was going to say, we are talking about reality TV as if it is this one coherent block, although we've all talked about the wide range of things that we might talk about as falling under reality TV. And I actually think it's less of a stable thing than we might say, you know, reality TV, we all know what we're talking about here. But I think that the boundaries, like what separates documentary from reality television, has a lot to do with also the discourse around this claims to be reality television, this claims to be documentary, in ways that we can think about shared techniques, like you were talking about, in terms of where the camera is and how the composition is put together.
Sure, who's actually doing something. I mean, I would suggest that PBS's Frontline series is not reality television in the sense we're talking about, that it's a study of two distinctions I would make. One, it's actual behaviors by actual groups, and also I think it's not reductionist, which is to say we don't end up studying the individual lives of particular people, but we're looking at social, political, demographic trends, and it gives us a bigger picture of something that's happening to all of us instead of just to a few people.
I might agree with Theresa a little bit, though, here. I think that you're going to have a hard time. The line between documentary and what many of these shows are doing is going to be a very blurry line. It's going to be hard for you to lay out definitions that exclude one side or the other.
Well, I mean, on the whole, I think reality television corresponds more to tabloidism and to the Weekly World and to the National Enquirer, and in the history of journalism, to yellow journalism. And in that sense, journalism, within the bounds of the straight news, journalism has been fighting its own battles with commercialism and the sort of pandering to readers to get eyes in front of the newspaper to sell to advertisers. And so there's a distinction I would make there, but also there's nothing journalistic about reality television itself. I think it's an entertainment medium. And not pretending to be documentary.
I think there are some shows, though, that blur the line quite a bit. I've seen a few episodes of something called My 500-pound life or my 600-pound life,
It's 600.
where they follow people through
It's hard to watch
It's very hard to watch.
because you're observing somebody's pain, and you're observing the risk that the person of the week is taking. And I think it's kind of gratuitous. I do. I think it's voyeuristic and gratuitous, and I object to it. I find watching somebody else's life on the line for reasons that I couldn't imagine to be just a bit much.
You know, but I do agree with you on the fact that when the actors and actresses went on strike, that's when reality TV really boomed. But I think prior to that time, I think we had a more mild version than what we are seeing today. I think when that explosion happened, and let's be honest, you know, reality TV is driving entertainment news now. A lot of these shows that I have never seen, I have never seen the Kardashians, but I could pick them out of a lineup.
Sure.
So, you know, even if you don't necessarily want to have that information in your life, that information still gets into your life somehow.
Sure, and so there's a highbrow, lowbrow distinction we're making here, and I think we're characterizing television in general, but reality television is lowbrow. It's not the McNeil-Lehrer report.
No, it's not.
But each show is completely different, and each one has its own good points and bad points also. I think as we're talking about this, we're all focusing on some of the ones that we think are sort of the lowest, and there's a lot of them that fall in some kind of middle ground and have redeeming value. For instance, and again, in talking to my son and his girlfriend about being on this program, they were saying that there's a show, I can't say the title right now, but about teenage mothers that would definitely discourage girls from going down that same road. So it is reality TV, and we are looking at things like the car crash, and yet at the same time, I think they're trying to teach lessons and keep other girls from going down that same road.
Well, I would just add that what's high culture and what's low culture flips, right? And I don't want to put myself in the position of arbitrating what TV shows fall in the low culture end of the reality TV show spectrum and which ones go in the high culture end of it. But I take an optimistic perspective on a lot of the content on television, and on the whole, I really like the view that these are resources. I'm really influenced by the work of John Hartley that sees these shows as providing us with imaginative resources, in his words, for telling stories, whether they be about certain aspects of our lives, certain groups in society, certain phenomenon. And that's not to paint everything in a sunny light, that everything we have on television is all positive narratives. Certainly, we can kind of spend a lot of time thinking about really negative forms of representation. But I think that I try to keep a balance here where I see a lot of potential also.
See, I would follow the Canadian media theorist Dallas Smythe, who argued that content was, by the way, that the real workers in media and television are the people who are watching, because they're the ones who have to participate to satisfy advertisers and to make the capital momentum go. And so reality television is a real low-budget way to get people to watch and to sell advertising. There's a sort of political economy argument there.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the advertisers. You know, reality TV has given them a new demographic, and a demographic that they wanted to reach. But are they paying an extra price by associating, you know, for instance, you know, we had the Duggar family recently went through a scandal. The family that was associated with the Toddlers and Tiara girl, Honey Boo Boo, you know, their family went through a scandal, and all of that reflects back on the show and reflects back on the advertisers. So, Mike, you might be the best person to answer this question, but, you know, is the risk worth the price and what you're getting out of it?
Well, I'm not sure at all that I am the best person of this crew to answer this, but let me just try. I think that it's only slightly riskier. I think that these kids are able to compartmentalize the advertising apart from the show to a large degree, and if there is some risk for them, the advertisers, I think that it may be outweighed by the fact that these shows are what they call stickier. And like instead of just looking at straight ratings analysis anymore, what they'll look at in broadcasting and cable magazine is how sticky a show is, which is sort of how much are people tweeting about it, talking about it on Facebook, how much are they engaged with it, as opposed to just how many total raw numbers of people they got. And what happens is there's a few things that are scripted, Walking Dead and a few other programs that are sticky like that, but many of the things that get talked about the most are these reality shows. And I think that these kids almost feel like the Kardashians are part of their extended friend network.
Well, there is that sort of parasocial effect in television where people develop the perception that they have a relationship with somebody who's on television. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the use of social media, because a typical the typical viewer of television often has got several platforms open, a phone, an iPad, a laptop, and is sort of keeping it going all at once. And so when we talk about reality television, television may be the core of a particular production, but not all of it. So.
Agree.
Any thoughts, Theresa?
Well, actually, kind of putting these two comments into conversation, the readings that I've done on reality television, I'll say it's a genre of TV that's well poised to capitalize on exactly what you said. You can think about American Idol and Calling In, and so as their genres kind of come into its own, it's situated amid a context where interactivity is kind of the way people watch television. And the historical readings I've done on this also say that it's also a response to advertising when people have TiVo and can skip through commercials, and you can then advertise. Product placement in shows is certainly nothing new with reality television, but that there's a lot of opportunities there for advertisers, and from an economic, it's cheap, and so there's also like a lot of economic legs that would give reality TV shows a boost.
And Frank, one of the things you talked about earlier was kind of this altered reality with the shows. They tend to be a little bit more emotional. Even given horrible circumstances, it seems like their emotions kind of boil over. You know, is that coming back into our culture? So the kids that are viewing this, do they now see that as more normal to behave kind of in one extreme or the other?
There is an argument for what in mass communication theory we call main effects, where people are directly affected by what they view. I don't know what younger viewers are doing with the content, but I do know that when someone fails to win American Idol, we watch them crumble, and so there's a kind of intrusiveness in a political, I mean, in a personal experience that. I'm not sure how to characterize what my response is, that I can't do anything to help them, and I feel like they're kind of victimized by some of the circumstances they've been led into. But I haven't done the research to know what younger audiences are doing with it. Clearly, it's wildly popular.
And just to play devil's advocate for a minute, the losing on American Idol or Survivor, although it's hard and difficult to watch, has been going on for years and years and years. It's basically the same as sports television, which has been going on since the dawn of television, really. And there's winners and losers, and you see people. So I'm not sure that just that in and of itself makes these shows bad.
Do you remember the Ted Mack Amateur Hour?
Vaguely.
I'm 54, so it was an amateur talent show on network television, and it was very much like the shows we're talking about. But without the sort of angst.
Yeah, and you also had on the radio too, weren't there some radio shows that did contestant type? I guess you didn't get to watch, maybe you got to hear people being let down, not meeting a goal.
Well, I think Survivor in particular, or Cops, let's talk about an old show that.
Yeah.
They're sort of designed maybe for an audience that is increasingly desensitized to the emotional and sometimes violent aspects of what's going on. And then there are, excuse me, there are class distinctions to make too, where the people who are 600 pounds and are unfortunate and fall into a particularly lower class status, or the people who are being chased by the Miami Police Department over backyard fences are lower class. And there's some criticism available to that kind of television.
I'd actually love to just pick your brain a little bit about this too, because it certainly makes me think that we see lots of horrific representations of people across all genres of television, though. Like, we have drama stories in which we are seeing abuse, public shaming, all of the things that we are associating with reality television here. Do you think we've seen a shift in the way in which maybe in other aspects of television that aren't self-consciously marketing themselves as reality television, there's some kind of shift in the extremity of what we're seeing?
I don't know. I mean, one of the things television is good at is giving us a kind of aspirational context. And so Dallas, the series, portrayed a kind of exorbitant wealth that we could only fantasize about. Soap operas give us the opportunity to experience emotional circumstances which I assume most of us aren't involved in. And so that's a kind of classical role for drama in itself, that there's a kind of catharsis that we get from participating in things that we virtually or indirectly. So you're right.
It's making me think a lot about, like, where do we find, where do these threads come from, and what are we seeing? I'm very interested in, like, what is reality television maybe doing to some of these pre-existing?
Well, I think my basic position is that reality television is less reality and more television, and I think that the construction of particular circumstances that are based on class, race, economic status, physicality, that those are particular touch points that carry a lot of freight, and I'm willing to be critical of them because of the way they construct meaning between the show and the viewer. I think it puts the viewer in a position of imagined power, which I don't think is necessarily the same thing that we've had in previous generations.
People have complained about the news for a long time. They'll look at their local newspaper and they'll say, I don't like this. And when people have said that to me as a journalist, I've looked back at them and said, this newspaper is a mirror of your community. This is what's happening within your community. So if you don't like what's on these pages, the mirror is reflecting what's already out there. Is that, to a certain extent, what reality TV is doing? So whether or not we think it's real, and I think that's a debate that we can have. I don't know if we'll have time for it. Is reality TV just kind of showing us the things that we already do?
Well, if it's a mirror, I'd say it's some kind of funhouse mirror that sort of exaggerates reality. But getting back to your previous question, I don't know that I believe that it lowers the standards of people that watch it. To me, it seems like it's us and them, and there's a line there. And, I think people would watch, say, Jerry Springer, but I don't think they want to act like that. It was entertainment. It's not education.
Got me thinking about your example right now, and as well as the threads about voyeurism.
Is somebody going to come running out here and turn my chair over? I don't know.
I don't think so. Did you want that to happen?
No. I mean, we get the Jerry Springer effect.
Yeah.
Be a little reality. And, in Iowa, we've had a particular investment lately in reality TV. I mentioned Sean Johnson being on Dancing with the Stars. More recently, we had Chris Soules on The Bachelor. I have to admit that is one show I absolutely do not believe it is real in any way, shape, or form. I just don't get it. And I have friends who watch it and love it.
Yep.
Well, I think your question has to do with some notion of causality, and I don't think that reality television causes the behaviors in society. It does reflect them, and there's a kind of dialogue. But my position is that we have choices to make about which parts of society we valorize and seek to validate, and which ones we don't. And so for example, the reality show that Bruce Jenner's going to organize, I think, he's doing that, right?
Caitlyn Jenner's show. Caitlyn
Jenner now is an interesting sort of moment for people who are transgendered to see themselves on television in a striving and positive light, and so I think it could have a positive effect. But we have choices to make, and I think the lower end of reality television has the sort of nutritional value of Cheetos, that it's the junk food of television, and that we really ought to make more intelligent choices about the media we consume and be a little more critical of it, apart from the notion that it's just entertainment.
It's interesting. I actually use the same food analogy when I talk about reality television a lot.
Well,
But
Cheetos are the perfect junk food.
well, I usually go with crumbs, but, because it also, I do think, like you were saying earlier, that there are larger dynamics that are at play, that we're watching issues about class, about race, about
Sure.
sexuality. And so I often use that crumbs metaphor to tell students that there's something there that we should watch, that even though we might think about nutritional fare and what's at the bottom, I think that there's merit for the reasons you're talking about in attending to these things as objects of study, even if not to valorize the behavior that's coming out of the television
Sure,
shows.
sure.
If it's,
There's a bit of critical detachment, which it could be very useful, but that's a learned behavior, and I think most people assume when they're reading the newspaper or listening to radio, watching television, or consuming social media, that they're consumers and that they're rather passive. And I think the point that I try to teach students is that they should be critical consumers and make discerning judgments about what it is they're watching, instead of just loading up their media trays and going to eat.
But in the real world, though, most people are just going to watch what they want to watch, and the Cheetos may be what they want. I mean, Cheetos sell.
Cheetos sell very well. I mean, they are actually judged to be the perfect crunchy treat. I eat Cheetos every now and then. It's okay.
But I don't go into a New Pioneer Co-op, though, and have them give me Cheetos along with my order. But when reality TV, we're talking about the Kardashians, I don't personally consume them, but I hear about them on the news. I hear about them in social media. And honestly, we're coming really close to the end of our show. We only have a couple minutes left. This reality TV goes by really fast once we get started. So just very quickly, let's kind of talk about whether you love it or whether you hate it. How do you kind of manage your own consumption of it?
Personally, I'm just not especially interested in very much of it. I don't like Cheetos very much, but others feel differently.
I don't watch a ton of it, actually, even though I'll actually probably do my most reality TV watching when I'm preparing to find clips to talk about reality television in a classroom setting. But I think it's valuable for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about here as a text, as something that's worth talking about, the social currents that run through it. And so you're right in terms of it's a popular pastime. If we want to talk about its prevalence alone, that gives it, in some ways, a status that's worth talking about and attending to. And so I like it as an object of study, even if I keep my personal viewing habits to competitive cooking shows.
Last word, Frank.
I'm concerned about the way the Kardashians represent women, and I work with women. I'm raising 2 girls. My wife is a professional. I feel like that puts an undue burden on them to measure up to a ridiculous behavior, a ridiculous beauty standard. And I'm equally concerned about representations of race and class in the same fashion, because I have a particular position on that. And while in the classroom, I try to be equitable and be welcoming of all different perspectives, there is such thing as morality. And as a feminist, I'm really concerned about that. And I think that the critical detachment that we seek to teach, as you said, is not always available to viewers. And so a critical voice from those of us who can give it is probably important.
Okay. Well, you know what to do now if you disagree with us, if you're very angry with me calling The Bachelor a lie, check in on our Facebook page. And until next time, Ethical Perspectives on the News.